Today, the Alabama Department of Public Health made changes to the way they track deaths in terms of both reporting it and counting it. Our Kayla Carlisle has the latest.
Today, Dr. Karen Landers with the Alabama Department of Public Health assured folks that those numbers will now be more reliable. The new number will include people who tested positive for the virus before their death and people who have been confirmed with the virus after death.
We were looking at every death, investigating every death, and until that death could be determined whether to be attributable to COVID-19 or not, that was in our overall numbers of deaths reported, and then we had a number that was attributable or not attributable to COVID.
The new count comes from an order from the CDC and the National Vital Statistics Service. In addition to the new count, Dr. Landers explained what they classify as a, quote, recovered COVID-19 patient.
What we in Alabama are looking at is not really using that term at this point, but rather noting that persons who were asymptomatic at the time of interview from the results that we received, or persons who no longer had symptoms at the time that we interviewed them. These persons will be considered in that broad group of persons.
Madison County Commission Chairman Dale Strong added that even though things are looking up, getting back to normal isn't expected to happen overnight.
This is not a switch we're going to flip and everything suddenly return to normal. Everything we're doing now, from social distancing, wearing a face covering, and not gathering in large groups, is our new normal. There is a possibility we will see a spike in cases once the stay-at-home order is lifted, and we are prepared locally to respond if that time comes, but it's up to all of us to protect ourselves.
Putting the Valley First, Kayla Carlisle, WZDX News.
And here's a look at the latest coronavirus numbers. Remember, we're about the facts, not the fears. Statewide, there have been nearly 200 deaths confirmed by the Department of Health. Now nearly 6,000 confirmed cases across the state, including 205 in Madison County. And from a national standpoint, we are just over 51,000 cases.